Hello everyone, how's everyone today? I'm actually working on my lesson prep for tomorrow, but I also took the trouble to type out a 4,000 word essay for you entitled What is Socialism, right? Now, I'm also going to print this essay out and distribute it amongst my fellow Malaysians. But let's just say that you don't like reading for some reason or other. I'm going to read this essay out for you as well on camera, right? Are you ready? Let's begin. What is socialism? I'm sure many Malaysians have heard phrases such as communism, socialism, and Marxism, Leninism being used in a disparaging light. Now, whether you've been living under a rock, you are probably aware that for a plethora of historical reasons, socialism does not enjoy a good reputation in Malaysia or any other capitalist country such as America or Great Britain. The ruling class elites all over the world, such as the far right-wing Canadian Professor Jordan Peterson, the late American President Ronald Reagan, and the Malaysian right-wing leader Tan Sri Hadiawal regularly conjure up frightening images of gulags, mass starvation, and barbaric gun-toting guerrillas in order to convince the people that socialism is ultimately a dangerous and impractical system that has never worked, a philosophy of poverty and resentment, so to speak. As the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill once said, socialism is a philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery. Unfortunately, this bourgeois definition of what socialism not, is not, has not, and never will be what socialism really is. It's funny because people who like to condemn socialism don't seem to have a clue as to what socialism really is. Socialism is not a matter of hating people for being born into a rich family or wanting to punish people who earned their wealth honorably and respectably. For example, if a musician busking on the street earns $1,000 a day, socialists do not go after that street busker because that street busker is not a capitalist, right? He or she does not own the means of production, which means the factory, the company, or any other piece of private property that can be used to generate profit at other people's expense, right? He or she is receiving money in terms of tips, sorry. And so all that money is clean money. That's not what socialists go after, right? And no, socialism is certainly not a matter of imposing state control over the workers by a megalomaniacal dictator like Pol Pot. The hijacking of socialism by nefarious, opportunistic forces, much like the hijacking of Christianity or Islam or Judaism by opportunistic forces, such as when Zionist military men kill, abuse, and torture occupied Palestinians, is an unfortunate side effect of how something good can end up getting twisted and contorted into something bad when it falls into the wrong hands. Just as one should not blame Christianity, Judaism, or Islam for violent terrorist acts carried out by its purported followers, one should never blame certain bad faith actors who have taken the words of Karl Marx and misused them for their own cynical agenda. The first misconception we have to address is that socialism is not a Western ideology. Now, there are some people in Asia and Africa and other parts of the non-Western world who maintain that socialism is indeed a white man's philosophy, which has no historical or material basis in our civilizations, to which I disagree. Socialism is quite simply a system which empowers the masses rather than a few privileged individual elites and seeks to dismantle social classes. That is the ultimate goal of socialism. Even before the advent of capitalism, after dismantling the feudal system, capitalism arose, right? Socialism as a theory had long existed, albeit in a more primitive form. The Chinese philosopher Confucius may very well have been the first Chinese Marxist, despite living 300 years before the concept of China even came to exist, and over 2,000 years before Karl Marx was even born. Any honest follower of Confucius would tell you that the man was vehemently against the private accumulation of wealth and the pursuit of individual self-interest. To quote a line from Confucius, if I may, exemplary persons help out the needy. They do not make the rich richer, right? Much like in the same way Adam Smith despised landlords, ironically, as did Winston Churchill, the big darling of conservatives, Confucius despised merchants, viewing them as parasites on society who simply passed goods from one hand to the next, but did not produce any value for society, only reaping profits. Confucius challenged the greed and corruption of the three noble families in his home state of Lu, the equivalent back then of people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. And he angered the establishment so much that he was expelled. They even sent assassins to try and kill him. I mentioned that socialism was about empowering the masses, and Confucius did that by providing an education to those who could not afford it. In the time of Confucius, the hierarchy was very, very clearly delineated. And if you were the son of a farmer, a peasant, you would be a peasant forever, right? Much like the caste system of India. Education was strictly for the sons of wealthy elites, and they intended to keep it that way. Much like private property is the sole product in this day and age. When I say private property, I mean businesses, as in, big businesses. That is the sole product of that belongs to the sons and daughters of the privileged class today, right? Because behind every booming young entrepreneur is a pair of rich parents, right? Okay, so as I said, in the time of Confucius, the hierarchy was very, very clearly delineated. So if you were born a peasant, you were a peasant forever, right? So if knowledge is power and those who own it can rule the world, Confucius was empowering the people by providing them access to knowledge, right? Not to a select few of people. Just like Buddha provided knowledge to the masses, right? But to all who wanted to learn and better their lot in life, right? In that regard, although Confucius still believed in the natural hierarchy of king and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, the fact remains that he should be considered progressive by the standards of his time. And had he been born today, he would no doubt be calling himself a socialist. The Buddha, in seeking to abolish the cruel and inhumane caste system, can also be called a socialist before socialism, the very first Indian Marxist, so to speak, right? And even the Prophet Muhammad, whom our Muslim friends hold in great reverence, also preached on the importance of collective responsibility towards one society and urged his followers, rich and poor alike, to be kind to each other and to treat each other like brothers and sisters. Even though the Prophet Muhammad never heard the word socialism in his life, it is evident that he believed that people should not be divided based on race or social class, but on piety and love for justice, right? And that is why many prominent Muslim socialists, such as the late Dr. Burhanuddin Helmi, Malcolm X, and Abdullah Sidi, do not see socialism as mutually incompatible with their religious beliefs. And Buddhist or Confucian socialists like myself do not see the pursuit of social justice and the dismantling of social classes as a hindrance to Asian values, as we believe our predecessors would also share our views had they been born in this era, right? The name most frequently associated with socialism is the name Karl Marx. Karl Marx was the German economist and philosopher who is famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, for penning the revolutionary document, the Communist Manifesto, which is considered essential reading for anyone who calls themselves a socialist today, right? Mr. Marx is also famous for his book, Das Kapital, his magnum opus, a humongous 3-volume book that was penned over a period of 2 decades with meticulous research and investigation in the trends of society. Now, a common misconception is that Karl Marx invented the term socialism. How a 12-year-old boy could have invented such a profound term is beyond me. As a matter of fact, it was actually coined by the British socialist Robert Owen in 1830, when Karl Marx was just 12 years old. Its concept existing long before either Robert Owen or Karl Marx were even born. Karl Marx certainly did not invent the social science of socialism, nor did he ever claim to. He, like Darwin, was a transmitter. He was merely outlining his observations about the world and penning it down for a European audience to understand. Socialism is not an invention, it is a social science, after all. Socialism and biology as subjects had existed long before Marx or Darwin were even born. Which is why I don't call myself a Marxist. I consider Marx to be an influence of mine. But if you're calling yourself a Darwinian, oof, that's probably a very, very big red flag, yeah? If you know what I mean. It's not a communist red flag, by the way. It's a terrible red flag. To sum it up, Marx believes or basically divides the progress of human civilization into a few main stages. Firstly, you have barbarism, in which people live in hunter-gatherer tribes. Then you progress on to slave society, as in the Romans and the Greeks, the classical societies of antiquity, like the Romans, the Greeks, the Han Chinese. And then you've got feudalism, in which the serfs serve a feudal lord and give him tithes or tributes, a part of their produce to live on his land, right? And then you've got capitalism, which arose out of the Industrial Revolution and the method of production evolving from an agrarian method of production to an industrial one, in which the businessman who owns capital is the new age feudal lord, and the serf is now a worker whose only thing he has to sell is his labor power. Socialism, when social classes, is the next stage that comes after feudalism. When social classes start to be dismantled due to the workers rebelling in one way or the other and seizing the means of production. And then finally, this is the final stage of human evolution, which, for all intents and purposes, has not yet been achieved. The final stage is communism, the ultimate end goal, which is a hypothetical, classless, moneyless, stateless world completely free of exploitation, when society has advanced philosophically to that extent that there's no more need for classes, nation states, money, right? But that's a debatable theory. I mean, many socialists don't really agree with that, and that's fine. But socialism is what we're pushing for at the moment, right? Because we now live in capitalism, and we're pushing for the next stage, socialism. While most human societies undergo this process, this several step process, there are certain historical exceptions, such as Lenin's Russia and Mao's China, which jumped straight from feudalism to socialism without the capitalist stage. Unfortunately, the Cultural Revolution was a disaster, as it was an extremely fragmented and disorganized movement of ragtag idealistic young rebels that did not involve ample scientific socialist analysis, right? It's not simply a matter of temper tantrums against the rich, like they did in the Cultural Revolution. It is analyzing the root causes of poverty and pulling them up by their roots, right? That is socialism, dismantling unfair hierarchies. Karl Marx said, "The history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggles." To Marx, class struggle was the oil that lubricated the gears of history, propelling the world forward. In his view, people act according to their own class interests, and the conflicting interests of both the ruling class and the masses would inevitably lead to a clash to settle those irreconcilable contradictions. For example, when the Roman slave Spartacus gathered a group of his fellow slaves and rebelled against the tyrannical Roman authorities, that was a form of class struggle. When the French revolutionaries abolished the monarchy and established a democratic republic, that too was a form of class struggle. When brave Palestinian peasants or brave Palestinian farmers put up resistance against the cruel and malicious Israeli occupiers who tried to seize their farmlands and turn them into serfs on their own land, that too is class struggle. When workers go on strike to express their displeasure against the greedy and exploitative capitalists who bully them, that too is class struggle. As a matter of fact, you have probably participated in class struggle yourself. You see, if you criticize and condemn corrupt politicians, and you call on world leaders and other authority figures to be held accountable to the people, that too is a form of class struggle. Democracy is class struggle. If you are part of a trade union that agitates for better working conditions, that too is class struggle. If you report an unethical employer to the authorities, that too is class struggle. To Karl Marx, there would come a time in the future when during the capitalist era, when a revolution would occur, and the proletariat, the common working man, would rise up and seize power from the bourgeoisie, the businessman, like the revolutionaries of France rose up, marched to the Palace of Versailles, and seized power from the king. Minus the head chopping part. I don't think they're going to be cutting off the bourgeois guy's head off. They're not going to cut the guy's head off. They're just going to turn him into a worker. Okay? I assure you, it will be done with as little bloodshed as possible. Okay? The working masses would eventually rise up and take over the factories, companies, and businesses in which they were employed, right? See, the socialist role is not to convince people of the inherent superiority of socialism, because we don't view socialism versus capitalism as two conflicting ideologies in some culture war. Socialism to us is an inevitable state of things. It is an inevitable stage of human evolution, right? In the more enlightened future. But our job is to facilitate this process like a midwife facilitates childbirth. In other words, our job is to make this stage of history come sooner for the good of the many, right? It is true that labor produces for the rich wonderful things, but for the worker it produces privation. It produces palaces, but for the worker hovels. It produces beauty, but for the worker deformity. This was from Karl Marx's essay on estranged labor, written in 1844. The Industrial Revolution of Europe saw the rise of a burgeoning upper middle class from the ash heap after the last remnants of feudal property relations had been burned. Bourgeois economists are correct indeed to say that capitalism has indeed lifted millions of people out of poverty. After all, the upper middle class English merchants from Jane Austen's novels, had they been born 100 years earlier, might have been poor farmers with far more modest living standards. They had therefore graduated from farmer to slave master, since it was the sugarcane and cotton plantations to which these people owe the pleasure of their enormous wealth. It would, however, be dishonest and undialectical indeed to say that the transition from field to factory made everyone in Europe worse off. On the contrary, the free market gave many people a standard of living that they would not have dreamed of in feudal times. The question that should be asked, however, is at what cost? While millions throughout the world have indeed been lifted out of poverty by capitalism, hundreds of millions more have perished and suffered as a result of it. Sweet commerce indeed. It would also be misleading to say that capitalism is an evil system. There are no evil systems, only evil people. However, the predatory nature of capital means that the free market must naturally become, sometimes literally, a cutthroat enterprise, with each capitalist competing against one another for their survival. As the goal of the capitalist is maximizing profit and minimizing loss, they must sometimes rely on unscrupulous methods in order to ensure their own survival. At the most extreme, this even included slavery and child labor. Why, I ask you, did the British come to Malaya to colonize us? Why would they leave the comfort of their own homes, sail thousands of miles away to some foreign land, right? The answer is very simple. Resource extraction and exploitation of cheap labor as a result of destabilizing these countries and driving the people into grinding poverty. Before the British colonized India, for instance, it was a bustling, thriving global metropolis that was the envy of the world. Do you know why Christopher Columbus was looking for India? Christopher Columbus was looking for India because he viewed India not as some savage backwater place, but a great way to make money, right? Just like the American writer Mr. Parenti says, there is no such thing as a poor country, only an overexploited one. You do not come to poor countries to make money. Did you know that Indian wool was highly sought after by European merchants like Marco Polo due to its high price and enviable quality? Yes, Indian wool at one point in time enjoyed the same status that Italian wool today enjoys. After the British had ravaged India of its wealth and resources and turned it into a backwater slum, the British ruling class then had the cheek to say that they were carrying out the so-called white man's burden of civilizing primitive people and introducing the beauty and morals of Western civilization to these backward barbarians, while in fact that was simply a pretext of the rapacious capitalists for their love for spices and diamonds and curry. In fact, if you're wondering why I, as a Malaysian Chinese, am here and not in China, you can also thank the British for the pleasure of my company. Yes, my ancestors on the Sinke, the boat people side of the family, I'm half Peranakan, were forced to leave China for greener pastures after the drug-pushing drug cartel known as Britain had destabilized and devastated the once great nation of China because of their love for their favorite party drug called tea, which they craved so badly they were willing to commit murder for. You may also say the same for our Indian friends, whose ancestors were displaced after their homelands had been ravaged by the British East India Company, compelled by hunger and basically lack of resources to leave for Malaya and make a new life for themselves, only for their desperation to be exploited by the British capitalists who paid them low wages to work in the rubber plantations, the dangerous rubber plantations, and overworked them, much to the annoyance of the Malay working class, of course, who felt that these immigrants were stealing their jobs. In truth, the British were screwing all of us over, capitalizing, pardon the pun, on our lack of class consciousness. A same case can be observed in places like America, when the white working class feels that immigrants from places like Mexico or Asia or Africa are stealing their jobs and driving wages down, while in fact it is the capitalists who brought those people over in the first place after destabilizing their countries and forcing them to come, basically compelling them to come. Like I once said, you know, you don't go to the imperial core for its culture, right? You go there to take back the wealth that was stolen from you. I've said that once. As free market competition is a dog-eat-dog system, only the most vicious, nasty, and ruthless capitalists will end up coming out on top. And that is the reason why CEOs are never popular with the workers. They are, after all, very good at keeping profits high and keeping costs low. Those capitalists who try to be relatively ethical will end up getting screwed over by less principled capitalists. In other words, capitalism rewards people like Donald Trump, who promise everything and deliver nothing due to the way in which it is structured. But even the rare nice bosses who treat their workers with respect and dignity are still participating in a thing we call exploitation. Let's get one thing very straight. I do not mean to say that all bosses are terrible people. There are indeed some very fine people who own businesses and try their best to live moral, upright lives. But if they employ labor and reap surplus value, or in other words, profit, out of the labor they employ, they are still participating in exploitation. It is, after all, the workers who produce the finished product for the capitalist, but the capitalist who reaps the bulk of the reward without doing any real work. Tell me, does Giorgio Armani, for instance, sew his own shirts and cut his own dresses? No. It is the workers at his sweatshop at some third world country who produce the finished products for him. Yet ironically, with the low wages he pays them, they cannot even afford to purchase the 1,000 ringgit shirts or dresses that they produce. While the billionaire capitalist rewards himself for his hard work by buying private yachts and mansions for himself, the worker is thrown into a life of drudgery and deprivation, alienated not only from his natural human functions, such as enjoying life and being happy, a natural human right for all in the socialist's view, but also from the finished goods that he produces or she produces. The contradiction here is that the worker produces, but the boss reaps, right? Just like the serf, would produce, the feudal lord reaps, right? Due to the fact that the boss owns capital and the worker does not, the worker is forced to accept his terms and kowtow to him in an unbalanced power structure. Just as the peasant was forced to kowtow to the baron due to the so-called divine right of kings, the worker is forced to kowtow to the capitalist due to the divine power of the almighty dollar. Whatever the capitalist gives you, he can take away if you displease him, you see. He can't take your head off. No, we live in more civilized times, but he certainly can take your rice bowl away, which is necessary for your survival, right? Capital is what Marx calls dead labor without the worker, because it is the worker who operates the machines and facilitates the smooth running of business, right? Without the worker to turn the raw materials into finished goods and services, the capitalist may as well close shop. A worker without a boss is a freelance worker, while a boss without a worker is a useless person, quite frankly. To say that socialism has not created any good to the world would be truly misleading. Throughout history, socialists have agitated for change in order to better the material conditions of the workers and lead the world to a better, brighter future. The 8-hour workday was not given by capitalists out of the goodness of their hearts. It was won through the literal sweat, blood, and tears of socialists who throughout history have been arrested, beaten, and even killed for daring to fight for a better world. These concessions that we currently enjoy in the civilized world are not reflections of the inherent altruism of the capitalists, but rather hard-won freedoms that socialists quite literally put their lives on the line for through strikes, armed rebellion, and mass protests. Thanks to the tireless efforts of socialists all around the world, there's a mandatory minimum wage, labor laws that can, to a certain extent, hold irresponsible bosses accountable, banning of child labor in developed countries, public education and healthcare, and of course, here's an important one, a ban on slavery in the developed world. Make no mistake, the capitalist class absolutely would bring back slavery and child labor if they could, right? They've done it before. What makes you think they won't do it again, right? Because it saves money to have somebody working for you for free or to have children working for you for less, right? And that is why it is imperative that we fight to protect whatever tenuous freedoms we currently have. But more importantly, it is important that we realize the only way to prevent these things from ever coming back again, and the only way we're gonna ensure a bright future, not for the few, but for the many, is that if we commit ourselves to true revolution, by which I do not mean picking up a gun like Jinping did and waging an armed resistance against the business class. No, that would simply be impractical and unsuitable for our material conditions. You see, Malaya in the time of Jinping was a very, very different place. Today, there are hardly any jungles left for some communist guerrilla rebellion to happen. No, no, no. The goal is to convince the Malaysian working class of all races and religions, whether they be industrial workers, teachers, farmers, baristas, accountants, and so on and so forth, that they are all in the same boat. Despite the fact that the capitalists like to play divide and conquer with us through a series of race-based politics and religious gaslighting, the fact of the matter is that we have far more in common with a working class person of a different race than with a capitalist of the same race. Yes, I have far more in common with a working class Malay or Indian than I do with a Chinese capitalist. A white American capitalist and a black American capitalist will happily sit at the same table and eat together, while the white and black working classes will fight for their proverbial crumbs, each resenting the other and thinking that the other is the enemy trying to get a bigger share of the pie. Crumbs, more accurately. A Malay capitalist like Mahathir Mohamad and a Chinese capitalist like Vincent Chin, for example, do not have any ill feelings to each other. But they do depend on the lack of class consciousness in the Malay and Chinese masses and feelings of ill will and suspicion towards each other in order to prevent us from organizing. To quote Vladimir Lenin in his essay, Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. The capitalists divide the world not out of any particular malice, but because the degree of concentration which has been reached forces them to adopt this method in order to obtain profits. The way I see it, there's only one way to end race-based politics, and that's not by adopting the social democrat model of the Nordic countries, nor is it to call for their abolition under capitalism. And this is why I say this, because they will always come back in one way or the other, because the capitalist depends on race-based politics to keep the working classes divided, do you see? You have to dismantle the system altogether. You cannot simply treat cancer by destroying a few cells. You have to wipe it out completely through chemotherapy, isn't it? By instilling in the masses a sense of unity through class interests, the wool will be pulled out of their eyes, the eyes of the Malaysian working classes of all races, and we will realize who our real enemy is. It is not the Malay, not the Chinese, not the Indian, to whom we should point our finger at, but the capitalist who keeps us divided and exploited. We must not lose sight of the big picture while fighting for the capitalists' crumbs. Yes, The capitalist literally laughs himself to the bank, while we exploited proletariat fight against each other. It's time we finally put an end to race-based politics for good and usher in a system that will ensure true democracy and give true power to the people. I can promise you that it won't be easy and that the capitalists will resist us tooth and nail, but united we stand, divided we fall. Let's dismantle the employer-employee relationship for good and create relations of equality and mutual respect, not hierarchy. Let's give the workers what is rightfully theirs and make the parasitic classes work for a living like the rest of us. Disabled and mentally challenged people should be exempt from this, yeah? But every mentally sound, able-bodied man should not be able to reap profit off the labor of others, right? If they're going to reap wealth, they should do it with the sweat of their own hands, right? Let's strive for a better world, a world without exploitation, where we regard one another as comrades, not superiors or subordinates. A better world is indeed possible if we're willing to fight for it, and we are going to achieve it one way or another. Ini kalilah.